Okay, let's.
Okay, welcome again. Let me repeat again. It was a good exercise, actually. So,
Now you know the full title.
yes, I know the full title. Thank you so much for coming in person here in the seminar room and also on Zoom. Today, our speaker is Dr. Tom Harvey, and let me introduce him to you. Dr. Tom Harvey is our academic dean here at OCMS. He has written extensively on issues of church and state in China and Southeast Asia. He authored Acquainted with Grief, Wang Mingdao's stand for the Persecuted Church in China. And also he wrote numerous articles on social engagement and mission. In particular, Dr. Harvey examines ideological tensions in modern nations between the state and religious minorities. So today's topic is Chinese Christian diaspora in Britain and its impact on China and mission. So hand it over to you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Harvey.
And it's a real joy to be presenting again. This is just to give you a little bit of introduction. This was part of a group of lectures that were presented at London School of Theology. You've had a couple of those already presented, like Wang and Maureen Yeong, talking about different aspects in terms of the Chinese diaspora here in the UK and their impact on the UK. And the focus of those lectures was on this impact, particularly on Britain, right, and the Chinese churches. And they're both excellent lectures. And I really recommend to go back and look at those if you haven't seen them, because the influx and the growth of the Chinese church in UK is absolutely one of the most significant factors affecting the church in the UK. It's the fastest growing church body in the UK. So it's having all kinds of knock-on effects. My talk's a little bit different in the sense that I'm interested, as I've always been interested, is in mission in China, all right, and to and with China. And I say that purposely because, you know, the kind of mission I want to talk about is not Westerners going over to China to do mission. These are Chinese who may be returning to do mission. Go ahead and back up your slide there, right? Let's just leave it right there for the. All this touches upon the massive potential for mission within Chinese Christian churches, both overseas and on the mainland itself. So the two communities affect each other in interesting ways via their connections. In the UK in 2021, there are approximately 124,000 Chinese nationals residing in the United Kingdom. That was an increase from the 103,000 in 2008. So you can just begin to see the numbers really increase. Go ahead.
Does that include students?
We're going to talk about students, all right? There tends to be two Chinese names. Chinese are known as Huaren, the Chinese, and Chinese students are known as Haigui, all right? And Haigui means overseas return. And that's what it literally means. But Haigui have always been significant to China from the 19th century to the current time. It is this influx in this group of people who come overseas, either in business, but of course, especially students who have had an incredible impact on the 20th century of China. And so these people are of significant influence in China and will be from time to in years to come. In 2022, 28,930 Chinese students applied to UK universities, up from 25,810 in 2021. According to the University and Colleges Admissions Service, Chinese applying to university now have overtaken the entire number of applicants from Wales. So just the Chinese students coming in are more than a whole province in the UK, all right? And this is incredibly significant. The other thing that's really notable about that, you know, I'm a North American. The Chinese feel much more comfortable with students coming to the UK. And this, of course, has to do with international tensions and international politics. But mainland Chinese are somewhat concerned about students going to leading universities in the United States in case they might become subversive or be even used by groups like the CIA and others to infiltrate and overthrow Chinese political parties and government. So, and when you know the history of China, that's not an illegitimate fear, right? But they feel a little bit more comfortable coming to the UK. It's seen more as a neutral ground, not completely. The UK is in the West and represents some of the Western powers that China must deal with, but they see it as one of the avenues that they want to influence and also feel freer sending their students to. And the kind of academic prowess and reputation of the UK universities is incredibly high internationally, right? As it should be. And so that when you get a degree from UK, it has a prestigious place when you go back to work in China. So those numbers are very significant in terms of China itself. Right? Now on top of that, right, an estimated 5.4 million people among Hong Kong's population of 7.5 million that are eligible for the Hong Kong British National Visa Scheme, which allows successful applicants and their dependents to live, work, and study for Britain for up to 5 years. Since that, so 5.4 million are now eligible for applying for visa. Britain launched its visa scheme for Hong Kong after the security law was put in place. Now, the reason for that is it was seen as a sense of duty of the UK. Now, one of the things that's really interesting, I think this is important for people to understand because we don't always get it. There's a distinction between a citizen and a subject. All right. One of the things about the British Empire is it's full of people who were subjects of the Queen and the King, right? And so there's a sense of when you are a subject of the king also has to extend patronage towards you. This has always been a delicate political issue in the UK, but there's always been a sense of responsibility of, rightly so, of the UK government to show concern for those that were subjects of the realm. And that's true of Hong Kong. When the agreement went into place in Hong Kong, Chris Patten, who's also, I think, the chancellor of the University of Oxford, at least he was, all right, and he was governor of Hong Kong when I was there. He gave his guarantee that this agreement between them and China would be honored, and that the rights and freedoms of the Hong Kong people would be protected. And with the national security law that went into place, most saw that that had been wiped out. Right? And so there was a sense of duty bound. England had given its word and now had to be held accountable to the word. So Britain launched its B&O visa program in January 2021 in response to Beijing's imposition of the Hong Kong national security law, in which London said constituted a clear and serious breach of the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration that set conditions under which the city would return to Chinese rule. January to March 2022, there were 19,500 applications for the B&O visa scheme from the 15,600 from October in December 21, according to the features released by the British government. This figure, however, is down from the peak of 34,300 Hong Kongers who rushed to sign up in the first 2 months of the scheme. All right. I call this the Hong Kong phenomena. 153,708 Hong Kong British national overseas visas have been granted. 144,500 have moved to the UK as of January 2023, according to the Home Office. The British Chinese, and as a result of this, British Chinese Christianity has experienced a historic reshuffle and a historic growth, right? Now, this is really interesting because when you do look at studies of Chinese coming to Britain, both young and old, they tend to find their way to churches, whether they're Christians or not. All right, and it has a lot to do with the kind of things that they're comfortable with. And this is true in the United States as well. One of the reasons that they go to church is they want to meet people and they want to learn about culture. But they feel deeply uncomfortable about going to bars and discos and rock clubs. That doesn't seem like appropriate behavior for well-mannered people. But they like churches, right? The churches are nice and usually accommodating, especially evangelical churches, because they're fun to join. We've had several right here at St. Andrew's Church that have joined and over time became baptized. And it's been really interesting to hear their stories coming out of Hong Kong, coming to the UK, joining a church, and then coming to Christ, which didn't happen in Hong Kong, but happened here. Now, the other aspect of this is that we don't have fixed numbers on this, on how many academics have left or are considering leaving Hong Kong universities because of the shifting politics. But observers have said that the numbers appear to be rising at this time in Hong Kong. So a lot of scholars are now beginning to leave Hong Kong and resituate in the UK. Now, again, this has tremendous significance for the universities, for the work that universities do, the kind of impact of science and technology and thought. That kind of brain drain is hard to take on, but it's also beneficial to the countries where people come. And so this is a very, very important number. And I work in Norman in history. It's amazing the amount of those people who are scholars that not all, many are businessmen, but this impact of Hong Kong scholars is significant. All right. Now, we talk in terms of people movement in and out of nations. Go ahead and go back to push factors for the Chinese. What are the push factors? What are causing people to leave China, both in Hong Kong and the mainland, to come to the UK? Well, one is social disruption in China, and particularly now in Hong Kong, all right? But also other things, for instance, the whole thing with COVID lockdowns and those kinds of things. A lot of people felt really constrained during that time and are looking for a way to get out of that. I mean, it was not an easy time. If you go back in time, one of the biggest outflows in China, out of China, was after Tiananmen. After the Tiananmen, many students fled, right, and came and got their education in the United States. And we'll talk a little bit about that generation because it's important in terms of later to talk about what they represent in terms of China. The other push factors that has always led Chinese people to come to the West is business opportunities, right? And connectivity. We'll talk a little bit before, but one of the things that both Hong Kong and Singapore and other areas, the Chinese communities have been absolutely brilliant at being the connective tissue that makes modern business happen, right? And to be able to connect different groups with each other, right? Another one, again, is academic qualification and advancement. So if you have a degree from Oxford or Cambridge or Durham or Aberdeen or any of the other fine universities here in the UK, that promotes your career through time. And so it gives you ability both internationally, but also within China itself to be able to advance. One of the big issues is the fear of the loss of academic freedom. One of the things about being scholars is the air we breathe is based on our ability to think and our ability to question, all right? Many of you here are at OCMS as part of our PhD program. You need to show a contribution to knowledge, but basically you have to look at what's written out there and go, well, Dr. Harvey said this and this, but he got it wrong. How are we going to extend past that? He had some good things to say, but we need to leave him in the past and now start moving to the future. This is the nature of thought, but that's not always an easy thing to do. Because whenever you are questioning those who went before you, you are speaking truth to them. And power does not like to be questioned. Yeah, it's true of me. There are two ways to everything. There's my way and the right way, and they're both the same. But you won't have me as dean anymore, so they're big for me. Yeah. But many scholars come to the way, and this is true even when I lived in Singapore. A lot of scholars would leave Singapore because they didn't feel like even in their departments they were free to do the cutting edge research because they caused their more senior professors to lose face. And so instead of continuing on at NUS, National University of Singapore, they go back to a position at Stanford. And we're talking about top drawer academics, but we were friends because they're also Christians. They would go, Tom, if I stay here another 10 years, the field will pass me by. And this is my chance, and so, yeah, so these are some of the push factors that have led people to come to the UK. All right. Go back to pool factor. Is there a pool factor? Yeah, it's after the next one. Let's go to this one. Pool factors. All right. Now, what by a pool factor, I'm talking about factors that pull people back to China. All right. So if you want to understand mission and you want to understand the impact of China mission, you need to understand not only what's throwing people out of the country, but what brings them back. Okay? Because that's where the secret of mission begins to take place. Again, business and academic opportunity. All right. One of my best friends, he lives in Toronto. He was my student when I was in Guangzhou. He got assigned to his work unit, but he was brilliant. So he went down to Guangzhou. He got a job in an import-export firm out of Canada. And then they moved him to Toronto, where him and his family emigrated. Of course, they all got Canadian passports and visas. He's now doing around $21 million of business a year for the company in Canada in selling industrial boilers to major groups. And they can't get a better person than Xiao, because he knows China backwards and forwards. He knows all the connections. And he's a man of great integrity and a great person in terms of being able to make the connections for business to flourish. So Xiao came out of China, but he's full. That's the secret of his being able to be very, very successful. He's also an elder in his church, and it's good both ways. All right. Another pull factor is international scholars and exchange. All right. Scholars want to go back and forth. They want to be able to work and live in China. Some of the Chinese universities now are some of the best in the world. All right. Whether it's Beijing University, Fudan, Wuhan. The growth of academic endeavors and the kind of work that's being done there in many of the fields is absolutely cutting edge and some of the best in the world. One of our council of trustees is David Cranston. Many of you, of course, in the room know David. But David is working with a group of specialists in Chongqing, where they are mastering the use of ultrasound to be able to remove, through high-powered sound waves, to remove cancers from the kidney without any incision. Okay, that's all being pioneered in China, right? But if you get your degree here, you can go work there, or if you're an expert, you can go back and forth. And you need these kind of people that are coming and going each way. So, in terms of business, tech, scholars, all of these are in great demand, and they're great demand if you're bilingual and fluent and can have the kind of connections. So one of the things that is a pull factor for Chinese that have come over is to begin opportunities working back, because if you can make a deal, if you can use your expertise to connect with people within China, that's a pull back. So you're going backwards and forwards in terms of pull factors back to China. Finally, and again, as it's a push factor, but it's also a pull factor, is what we call serving as compradores. Now, comprador is a great old Portuguese term. All right. Now, if you lived in Hong Kong in the 19th century, you know what a comprador is, right? Because the comprador were the people that would go from the British businesses and go talk to the Chinese companies and others who are delivering goods and vice versa. They were Chinese. They were fluent in English and Chinese. And that way then most of them were Christians. And therefore they were trusted by both sides, especially on the English side, all right? But the Chinese wanted someone who they could talk to about business who wasn't English. I'm going to talk to a Chinese. So when you look, if you go back in the 19th century, some of the most powerful, wealthiest families of today began as Christian compradores in Singapore and Hong Kong. Right? And compradores have always, if you want to make money, it's for be a middle person between, especially groups that are antagonistic. Just don't say the wrong thing, you might lose your head. There's actually, I'll just say that aside, if you ever want a really interesting study, look up dragomans. Dragomans were middle people in the Ottoman Empire who had often been captured and been slaves, but they had been Christians and then they were taken as slaves, and then they became dragomans, who were the middle people who would negotiate deals between the Ottomans and the Venetians. Right? Warring parties, but the business had to flow. And but what was really interesting, and this is very good, you had to be very careful of translation. Because the way leaders talk to each other, they will try to degrade the other, but you can't translate that exactly. So we changed the language from my servant, the king of France, to the majesty of France, and the one upon whom the sun rises and the sun sets, from your humble servant, the Sultan of Istanbul. You always know your audience, okay? So, but this is true internationally now. For China's engines to go, they must have international players. So China itself will seek to connect and build ties with key Chinese diaspora in London, New York, Singapore, elsewhere, okay, in order to be able to connect business. Even during this time of the Hong Kong diaspora, Singapore has been part of the game, trying to get as many of the Singaporean Hong Kong to come up to Singapore as well, because they know this will be a key driver of the business. So these things are very, very important. Now I want to go back to here. Okay. Now, what this all represents then is a huge influx into the churches. We've talked about some of the social reasons for that, but as Norman knows, and many of the pastors know, the Chinese churches and the pastors and the team are getting overwhelmed. And I'm so glad that Norman's here, because these are saints we need to pray for, because the kind of work they're doing is absolutely essential. But also it's very difficult, because where people come from in China affects the dynamics of your congregation. And because of all the political issues, it's really hard to have a 50% Mandarin or mainland church and a 50% Hong Kong church, because there's tensions between the two populations. And then you get the wild cards like the Wenzhou ring coming in, who want to run everything. And everybody has their own characteristics. But regardless, it's the kind of problem you want to have, but you have a lot of people coming, but you can see that there's this growth of churches in the UK and these waves of immigration, which was the conference was all about. Now, the significance of this that I want to talk to that is about missions. I'm going to skip to ahead of this one. All right. Okay, so we had push and pull factors for Chinese going back and forth, but I want to talk about push and pull factors of Chinese diaspora and China mission. First, all right, you have this large Christian diaspora in the West. Okay, this large group of people who are often bilingual, who are Christian, often excited about their faith as people who are either new converts or in very exciting churches, are very interested in terms of the church of the West. You have the growth of Chinese churches in the UK. right? And you also are beginning to see, and there needs to be more of this, increasingly ethnic Chinese leaders in international mission institutions. Just last week or 2 weeks ago, we had Patrick Fung lecturing, who's the head of OMF in Hong Kong. And increasingly, I had the opportunity to work under John Chu, who is Archbishop of Singapore. And the kind of influence and how they govern and how they lead is really significant, and significant in terms of mission. There's a subtlety that they have, an ability to move that I think is matched by none. John and I didn't agree on everything, but I had to admit the way he made ties and saw the role of the Chinese churches in Singapore and internationally in terms of impacting the world for mission was significant. And that continues, all right? So you have this to and fro back in terms of mission, all right? In terms of pull factors back into China, many of the people who come still have family members or church. So even when, I think, Norman, some of the people who are joining us online are joining us from China, aren't they?
China, Hong Kong.
Yeah. So this is a way, they're listening in when this heretic Tom Harvey is preaching preaching from the pulpit at OCTC. All right, much safer for me to preach here in Oxford than get scooped up. All right, but those kind of connections remain very, very important and maintain lifelines back and forth to the church. One of the things that kind of linkage of family and church has helps in terms of research as to what's going on. So when I want to know what's happening in China, which is very hard to get information, especially during lockdown and that kind of thing, it was through family connections or those kinds of connections that came through the kind of links we have in Oxford that are allowed me to get information about what's really going on. Second, there's a fluency and a familiarity with China. So if they're interested in mission, if they sense God's calling in church to do mission, China is the natural place to go. Unlike Westerners who have to go to a language training course, they can jump on the plane and go. Even when we were in China, I mean, everywhere I was walking around, I had a big sign on my face that said Guilo. I would say Yang Guanzi, which means a foreign ghost. I mean, this face just stood out. But for my friends who were Chinese who came in, just with a couple adjustments of clothes, right, they could disappear into the crowd. It was just amazing to watch how they would work. Now that had some reverse effects that was really hard on them, because sometimes being a foreigner and with a foreign face, you get a deference. Whereas if you're Chinese, they'll often consider you as one of us. So I just had 2 grandsons born yesterday. But one of those was born to my son Paul, who was born in Fuxing, China. So he was born in Fuxing in Liaoning. And so I remember after he was born, of course, we were really proud of our son being born there. I said, now he can become Chinese. He said, no. He'll never be Chinese. He's an American born in China. But if we were a Chinese family and we had a Chinese son, they would have said, yeah, he's Chinese. Don't be, man. We said he's a Northeast guy, which is true. And so that sense of community connection. The other thing that's very, very important, it's no longer really, I mean, part of it still goes on of mission to China, but the huge thing in the room, I mean, the elephant in the room is mission from China to the room, right? There is such interest in the Chinese church. It's like a fire burning of people who want to go and want to be involved in mission. Now, it's not always done so. It's very hard to have open mission training centers, in Beijing without trouble coming. And then also it can be, you get to do mission while you need language training, you need cultural training, you need to know what's going on the ground, that kind of thing. That has been happening. It's gotten more difficult with increased surveillance and that sort of thing that goes on in China, but it's still happening. And part of what the overseas Chinese represent is they can come with missions expertise. and training, all right? They can come in and be able to hold sessions. They can develop sessions outside of China online and then bring them in and have them distributed in that kind. So the overseas Chinese church serves as that ever-growing influence and support for the churches in a way that is much better than Western support of those churches, because they know how it works. They know how to work within the Chinese culture wherever they're going, and often that's where they're from. So they know how to do mission well within those frameworks. So yeah, all of those are key pull factors for missions. All right. Now, one of the things I want to talk about is a contradiction, though, that exists within China. Part of that is with the whole issue of China and Christianity. All right. China in the early 70s, mid 70s was desperate. The Great Cultural Revolution had gone south. All right. There was literally the people were carrying goods around in Beijing in carts, all by people, because they didn't have enough motor vehicles to be able to carry them. And those were all mostly owned by the government and by the military. Everybody else was on foot. It was an absolutely horrific situation. And this is when Deng Xiaoping arises. Okay. And he needs to deal with this moribund economy. Okay? And his idiom was black cat, white cat, who cares how long that catches mice. All right. And that was to say we can bring in aspects of capitalism, we can bring in aspects of market into our system to get things going as a catalyst for all right. And this was to deal with both political and economic stagnation and the poverty and hunger that resulted in that. All right. And the other thing he did, which was absolutely critically important, is before the country was kept under ideological strictures through what was called the United Front organization. United Front Work Department. Okay. All right. Okay. And their job was to monitor all events in the country all the time, especially non-party affairs. Right? And so every non-party group had to have oversight by the United Front. So nothing could be done. But Deng Xiaoping realized he had to pull them back. All right. And so he reined them in and allowed people to begin to have organizations otherwise that were much more free. And the first thing was with the farmers and the communal farmers, which he released. We were in Guangzhou when that was happening. And the Guangzhou farmers all of a sudden were the rich people, all right? They had more money than the elites in the city centers because they were making money from them because they could sell goods independently. And they tied the hands of those tasked with ensuring ideological conformity and state control of all aspects of the economy. Now that had all right, so it allows for non-governmental organizations, scales back ideology, and the overall result is this absolute explosion of the Chinese economy. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, up till today, China has moved from a country that wasn't even feeding itself to being one of the most powerful economic engines in the world. It's only second to the United States, and probably some people are predicting will pass on the same. Who knows? That's pretty hot engine moving forward. But this creates a bit of a contradiction. And by contradiction, if you change the economic system, can Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought continue to rule and reign? Right? And this has presented a huge issue for the government, and especially with Xi Jinping, because what happens in the 90s and early 2000s is corruption begins to be rampant. The power of the party lessens. There is there not only growth of civil society in a good sense of where people can get together and interact, there's also a growth in just outright thievery, as people who are very powerful just seize lands that are not theirs. All right. And riots are beginning to break out across China against corrupt officials who are just taking things from others. Beijing was a classic case where they would just go into the old hutongs and scoop up the land, and then they'd give them almost nothing, and they would sell it, and they would be millionaires. Right? Xi Jinping jumps on that issue, and that's part of the way he rises to power. There were problems in that, and that also people power was beginning to be displayed, and that scared them somewhat. If you want a lot more detail about the rise of Xi, there's a great podcast series on The Economist called The Prince. I really recommend that you get a hold of it. It's done by a Chinese Malaysian journalist who was finally kicked out of the country, but her work is just really, really good. That talks about the issues that help the rise of power. One of the other things that I think a lot of people ask is, well, why is Christianity seen as a threat? It builds good citizens. It tends to build people who are, actually, we have a study here done at Oxford that shows that they answer the same as other people from mainland in terms of their loyalty to the country and their defense of China and their love of China. That there's no change in ideological stance with coming to Christianity. So they're strong defenders of the nation, and yet the state feels threatened. Now, why do they feel threatened by that? And this is very important whenever you're looking at a lot of countries. That's why the Chinese pay real attention to Iran when people are taking off the hijabs or other places. It's called the color revolution. Has anybody heard that word before? Okay, in Chinese, it's Malay Hua Ge, right? Jasmine revolution, right? And that was very term used in the 2000s because it was starting to get away, where you have this kind of people power. Malay Hua Ge is what was going on in terms of the streets of Hong Kong and the umbrella movement. This is what the leadership fears. And one of the things that they see in this, one of the things that rocked China to its absolute core was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they saw it was directly the result of color revolutions, and that key leaders and thought behind that kind of overthrow of that totalitarian state were Christian leaders. And even if they weren't Christians, they were tapping back into earlier Christian thoughts and roots. One of the key persons I read in this was Václav Havel's book, Living in Truth. And it's really interesting. You get in sections of Havel, who was pretty much an agnostic playwright and kind of a playboy and everything else, but he was a really good figure. But he was pointing back to the Czech Brethren. He was pointing back to the founder of the Czech Republic under Thomas Masaryk. And he was saying, they discovered what we must do. We must live in truth, right? But it was a Christian understanding of living. And so the Chinese have studied that and they fear it. All right. So they see Christianity as a rival, right? An ideological rival. Right? The church, I don't think, sees itself necessarily that way. And but the government does. And so now, so the response of the government to that, okay, let me just go. All right, okay, is inside of China, it has been the policy of Sinicization. Okay, so go to this one, like this Sinicization. Okay, so current Chinese policy, one of the things that Xi Jinping began to mention religion more than any leader in their whole, during the whole period of the communist, or since liberation. And Mao and Deng Xiaoping and other leaders, just Hu Jintao. Christianity isn't even hardly on their radar. Xi Jinping begins to bring Christianity up in political speeches in 2015, 2016, 17. Now, what Xi realizes is he's beginning to bump into, in the highest echelons of Chinese society, Christians. Not only that, from what we know, it's in the members of their families. Okay, and that's highly distressing. And so when you have a niece or you have a second, two generations, and the word gets out that they're attending a church fellowship, it's very destabilizing. And so this is something that they wanted to address, and they have addressed it through a policy called Sinicization. Okay, and Sinicization is the idea of making Christianity truly Chinese. That's So the Chinese 基督教中国化, okay, and that means is to make Christianity Chinese, all right? So 中国化is how you do that. But what that actually is a government policy, all right? It's not a religious thing about trying to indigenize or enculturate faith. It's very much political, and it has three levels. One is bureaucracy. So they did a major revamp of the bureaucracy between 2015 up through 2020. Okay? They put guess who they released? They released the United Front, right? They took the chains off their hands. Now the United Front is responsible for the monitoring of all non-Christian organizations once again in China. Okay? So every board had board members changed, right? Every charity, everything else. No longer is there any independence. It's all overseen. So bureaucracy has fundamentally changed. Also, one of the ways I describe it is that Chinese Christian groups of all sorts were beginning to build lateral connections. And these were growing very strong, both overseas and within the country. All right. They've changed that into bicycle spokes. All right. So everything goes to the center and comes from the center. Any sign of lateral movement will be punished, right? Everything you do in a church, official church that's known and you're reporting to the government, must be reported to your overstanding committee. And you cannot do anything. You cannot hire an assistant professor, assistant pastor, you can't start a Sunday school program. You cannot do anything without permission of the group that oversees all churches, right? And if you don't do that, then you can be subject to arrest or imprisonment or financial penalty, all sorts of things. So that's the bureaucratic change, all right? The next thing is they began to move in terms of ideological change, all right? So in ideological change, you can be a Christian, but you must show due deference to the rule of China, all right? And you must have things in their proper order. So one of the things that's going on part of that is there's now a whole translation of the Bible going on at Nanjing Theological Seminary, which is an absolute crazy thing because the older scholars didn't want to have anything to do with it. Because if they translate the scripture so that it shows deference to the political party in how certain passages are translated, then the church will all go, heretic. Right? And then I say, but you will be known for eternity as the one who twisted the words of scripture to line up with communist ideology. Right? On the other hand, if you don't do it, right? So for a long time, they were just kind of kicking the can around, and finally the government said, you've got till 2025 to complete this, right? Or else. Now what these guys are doing. So you have the scripture being changed. One of the things that you'll see in many churches now is a poster of Xi Jinping, right? Okay. As the great helmsman, the great ruler, right? Your sermons are monitored, all right? So they have to show deference. You have to have political teaching in the churches, right? On a regular basis, that kind of thing. Now that actually, in some ways, has put more pressure on the official Chinese churches than the underground churches. Because the underground churches, they're illegal anyway. So they're not going to do this, and they're already in trouble. So they have a little bit more of a free hand, but in many, I just was talking to some people who've been, in and out of China. One of the things they told me is it's different in different cities. So right now Beijing is really strict, but in some of them are outlying. It's business as usual. I mean, my strategy would be, if everything has to be approved, just so much stuff. They don't get weekends. Go ahead. But anyway, that's all going through that. So that was the second one. The third one was they changed the legal structure. And the legal structure was to make, before, unregistered meetings were allowed. Okay, you could do them, but you couldn't do anything illegal in them. As of February 20th, 20 February 2020, the law came, right? Which said no more. Any kind of meeting, Christian meeting, outside of official government registered churches is. Can anybody else tell me what happened on February 1st, 2020? In China?
COVID announced.
They had a lockdown. Which in some ways I think provided a cover to the church because they were about to start what's called a reduce to zero campaign. But because COVID overwhelmed everybody, it's kind of hold. So right now what we're watching is, okay, how does this all? Okay, so you have those three things. Now, how does that then? This is not, and with Xi Jinping and the party and what's going on within the country is to get everyone lined up to, all right, we can just go up to the role of CCP ideology on society and nation. This is now in all the schools. It's all going on, and there's a greater focus on the party and of the nation. All this is going on right now. But okay, what's the problem then with overseas Chinese and Chinese students? This is the wild card they can't control. Okay, you know, I can say, you know, if there's a Chinese student studying here at the University of Oxford, they say, "Have you done you're taking your whole Friday to study the ideological lessons from Xi Jinping?" Not only that, they've been taught to think. They've been, you know, their whole basis of being able what they want to do. I have lots of friends of this category, and they're all talking about this, but they're talking about it in a way that you can't talk about it at Beijing University. So there's much more freedom. So for one of the things, let me step forward. Okay, this is a huge contradiction for the government because students returning from leading universities around the world go right to the top spots. So these free thinkers, these people who think differently, are going to be the movers and shakers of this country, and China needs them to do. But how, you know, all right, they tend to ignore or subvert indoctrination. And between you and me, go ahead and go to the next slide. They're very good at it. I mean, one of the things, I mean, I just followed the Hong Kong protests, you know, just every day. And also with the COVID lockdown protests. They're so clever. They're so clever. The people come out and they hold up blank sheets of paper. Yeah. They don't say anything. What do you get arrested for? All right, I've never seen it. That means cleverness of
They
it.
still arrest. They still arrest.
They still.
Even if it was one.
I mean,
You can see the street. Or wanting to protest.
yeah, they're just being on the streets, all right. So overseas Chinese and those trained overseas are needed for China's economic engine to expand. And part of the dilemma they face is the very people they need are people who think on their feet, who can go, man, that's a bad idea. Doing it that way, we'll lose money. We should do it this way. All right. Those are the kind of people you need in an international business organization. You can't go, oh, because you, the great leader, have said so, that's what we will do. All right. You know, that results in disaster. Okay. Many have become Christians. So when they come back to fill business seats or that kind of thing, or go into universities, I'm always amazed because I go to these conferences where Chinese professors will be speaking, and afterward they'll come up to me and they go, "Oh, hi, I'm at Fudan, and I go to this church." And, you know, me and my whole family were Christian, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's amazing how influential they have become. And not only that, here's the thing that's Harvard security forces. This actually came out of South China Morning Post when they could speak more really low pop who is one of the great writers, newspaper reporters. But they were having these church meetings in hotels, in 5-star hotels in Beijing. And so public security comes in, they put them all against the wall and they get all their identity cards and they stack them on the thing. And then in comes the senior officer and he takes those and sets us up, starts going through them. And then he gets through the pack and then he goes to each one and hands them back their cards and says, leave, nothing will happen. because he knew within a second, these were all princelings. All right, the Chinese term is taizi, right? You do not touch a taizi, all right? These are the sons and nephews and daughters and relatives of powerful, right? And if you touch them, the powerful official will come after you, regardless if they're, heretic Christians are not following the party way, because you touch family, right? And family, you don't mess with, right? Which, at the same time, because you have parents who are Christians, all right, this represents a contradiction, okay? So all of these things that lead to implications for mission, all right? One of the things in terms of missions that all this tells us is we need the advancement of overseas Chinese mission leaders. There needs to be the recruitment and the development of young Chinese women and men who can be willing to serve Christ and bring Christ to China in clever and interesting ways, right? There are avenues to do mission and have impact for the people around us that are there and ready, and they need that calling and they need that sense, but they're in incredible teaching positions. We need to pay attention that student ministries in Alpha have an enormous impact on China. I've always been amazed at St. Andrew's Church when we have the Alpha courses, the percentage of Chinese that come up, because they just come over here and they're new students at Oxford, and now they can ask. They know about Christianity, but they've never been able to ask hard questions. So they're interested. And unlike kind of, sort of a lot of, other people who just go, yeah, maybe so, maybe not. But they're actually interested, and many of those become Christian. All right? So you have a lot of, so student ministries are very, very important, and so are Alpha ministries, and connecting them in that. Okay, the other thing that's really important is to see civil society as a faithful, fruitful harvest for mission. Now, what I mean by that is now, one of the things that's interesting about China is they have this thing called the 7 no talk about. It's called the Jibuzhang. Okay? And one of the things you're not allowed to talk about in China in any kind of academic world is civil society. Now, why would civil society be such a threat to Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party? All right, because it's civil society. What civil society is, it's a middle society, below the government, but not just individuals. Okay, and this is where people exercise self-governance, right? And it seems like business, it's like news, information, service industries, all these kind of things, and or groups and clubs that come together and that kind of thing. Society, all societies have elements of civil society. They would, and it's hard to get rid of them, especially in capitalist kind of economies, because you get these middle kind of grounds of groups of people that need that. Now, one of the most effective aspects of mission is in civil society. Even when we went as teachers of English as a second language, and it was one of the easiest places to tell people about Jesus. If I went to New York, they'd say, "Get out of here from go to China," and they go, "Gee, Mr. Harvey, you seem pretty smart, and you got a master's degree, and you seem to know a lot about a lot of things. We were told by the government that only stupid peasants in the countryside in America believe in Christianity. Why do you?" Yeah, well, maybe we didn't tell you the right thing. Oh, another thing, Judy, my Judy, I love her, but she's a bit of a fundamentalist on certain things. And one of the things I've learned the hard way is you never fudge on the truth. I don't tend to be some of a fudger, and I get in trouble. But anyway, one time she gave a talk, and somehow the talk with a bunch of students all present, a lot of students would come to our talk. And she somehow got on the subject of truth telling. And she said, at no time is it ever right to tell something that's not the truth. And that shocked the students. So they're asking, well, what if your relatives in the hospital, they're dying, and it's their last days? Don't you tell them, oh, grandma, you'll get better, you'll get stronger. She said, no. You pray with them, but you tell them the truth. That this, no, unless there's a miracle, you're gonna meet Jesus. Like, oh. They go, what if the only way you can get a job is through a back door? You know, and you have to tell kind of a tale to get in there. Better not to get the job. Then you better tell the truth. So anyway, and the questions are flying at her, all these situations where, you know, in normal culture, those would be places where you tell, you know, fudge on it a little bit, you know, that's kind of a. So anyway, the next 2 days later, her good friend Hui Yan, who's not next, but anyway, Hui Yan was kind of having a smirk on her face and kind of laughing. And Judy goes, why, Hui Yan, why are you got that grin on your face? You know, Judy said that Hui Yan says, oh, it's just something you said at the your talk. And she said, well, what was that? I just talked about, you know, life in America and everything. She said, there's what you said about truth, Helen. And she said, well, what was that? I just said, you know, you should tell the truth. And said, then she said, well, before you came, you don't know about this, but all the students and staff were gathered together with the whole institute and were told they were going to get foreign teachers. But they were not to trust the foreign teachers because they always tell lies. Now we know that you always tell the truth, but we know that you tell lies. Middle society has a lot of things. Businessmen that go to China that are Christians shock them. All right. Scholars who go to China shock them. So this whole area, even in Singapore, we had marketplace ministry. It's such an important ministry where people of everyday life doing every kind of day work, you know, put their faith in Christ and the kind of differences they make. And this is very, very important in terms of just Christianity in China. Okay, finally, keep an eye on China because it is likely that China will once again open up and offer great opportunities for mission by overseas Chinese and students returning to China. China has always been a pendulum of an opening and closing door. She has swung it one way, but it's about ready to start swinging the other way. And you just wait, you know, the time will tell. But I can tell you right now, this stricter policy will give way. It always has, and it will again. And that's why I mentioned about Tiananmen. The Tiananmen led China and said they'll never go back. They've seen their friends die in the streets of Beijing. But now they're international business people who go back and forth in China. And through that, they have their connections throughout the society. So that is my talk on China and how the diaspora cuts both ways.
Thank you so much. Shall we get our hands?
Yeah.
Yeah, for any questions, people here in the seminar room, raise your hands. And people on Zoom, please go to the reactions and click the button for raising hands, and I will call you. So anyone to start with your question? Yeah, Petros.
Non-Christians from Hong Kong to UK like to go to churches.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've always said that Muslims that come here to the West, they're always open, but the churches are afraid.
Mm-hmm.
So just like the Hong Kong students that come here, they're open to hear about Christianity because they already know Christians are going to tell us. But Muslim students are not approached even because, so I was just wondering, how can we capitalize this same phenomena with the Muslim students here?
Well, I think that's a good question. And I think that people from the different communities and Christians need to do that actively. I think part of the problem generally is, you know, sometimes it's bad manners to ask people to come to church. You know, it's like, all those, you know, they have their own spirituality and that kind of stuff. But most people who come over want to see, you know, and if you'll just ask people, would you like to join us for church? They will, even Brits. And they really are interested. And I think sometimes we as Christians are afraid that they won't want to come. And this was a problem with cultural Christianity in the United States as well. People will say, well, everybody's different, everybody can have their way. But actually, people are really interested. And so one of the ways to kind of turn around your numbers in any church is just to invite people in, go have a meal with them, go do those kinds of things. It's not rocket science, it's just. But I think you're right. I think a lot of Muslims are freer to attend church in the UK than they would ever be in their own country. So it's a real opportunity. Yeah.
Well, building on that, and those of us that mostly church leaders in our different nations. I don't know the answer, probably. The point is, how do we link in and collaborate with those mission sending Chinese, the people who want to? Because you say they want to come out, when you read books like the ones to Jerusalem and all this kind of thing. There's a push, there's a desire, but then mission strategy. For instance, I can think in Chile that if we could have an influx of well-strategized Chinese mission partners, there's a reaping in Chile. But how do we do it? What would you suggest?
In terms of the Chinese
making
diaspora
contact?
community or,
No, in terms of making contact with the right Chinese mission sending churches. How does that work? We have no access.
Okay, so yes, and
information.
and you need to be very careful. One of the things is Westerners, we tend to make mistakes in this area.
Yeah.
And we draw attention to people we shouldn't draw attention, but there are lots of people who have connections. You have to get to know who they are and then find ways in. One person who's one of our students, he'll be graduating here. This kind of person who's connected all through the church in China, David Rowe. But David knows how to talk, when to talk, and when not to talk. And David, you know that's the same issue with you guys with open doors. You have to be very, very careful and very, very sensitive because, and the Chinese are better at this than we are. They tend to know how to connect. And to a point, the other thing, David, I don't know if you ever ran into this. One of the things that we sometimes know more about how public security works than the actual Chinese on the ground in China. They didn't know what was going on, and we would have to go, watch out. We're being listened to. Some knew, some didn't. How you would do that is one is to work with Chinese groups that are working with the churches in China. But again, you have to be very, very careful on missiological grounds because they need to discover their own way. The way Chinese, that's kind of David Rowe's thesis anyway, is the way the urban churches are doing is very different than the way the African churches did mission. And so because one thing is the African church was in many ways did a wonderful job and everything, but they did it on a very thin budget. Okay? Many of the Chinese churches have money to spend and have people of high technical skill and that kind of thing. So one of the avenues to mission is with the Belt and Road project of Xi Jinping. But how do you do that? Is a real tricky thing. But these people are engineers; they're technical experts and all things.
So would a group like OMF be somebody to contact?
OMF would be excellent. Yeah. Peter Rowan, everybody involved with OMF.
Good. We go to Israel and
Hey, Israel.
Hello, Tom. Was wonderful to hear a little bit of Chinese history and Christian history and the expectations for the future. And I've been in China some years ago. It was very interesting to be at the Christian church there too. I've been teaching here in Norway about intercultural communication, and one subject it is about the inculturization or and assimilation, and you were pointing out about this Sinicization. Is that the right word in English? And I wonder how would you perceive that in the outcome in the Christian Chinese population today, because we are not talking about 100 Chinese believers, we're talking about millions of them. Will you say that mostly you can perceive that the Christian faith in China is a kind of, has been through a kind of acculturization or Sinicization, or it is in a way cultural indigenous church process, a kind of the natural process of being part of the Chinese culture. Because there is a difference between be integrated to a new society and or integrate, let's say, a foreign faith like Christianity, than to be an object of acculturization or Sinicization. How do you perceive that, the church today in China?
Well, let me first tell you, Israel, how I even got on this subject. I actually wrote an article in a book called Sinicization. And I was looking at how the Chinese church had become not the church in China, but a Chinese church. All right. So I talked about the processes of preaching, testimony, and hymn writing as three vehicles by which a foreign religion became deeply Chinese. And that was full of articles about this kind of thing happening. And that's what I always thought Sinicization was. And then I got approached by some people with The Economist who said, Tom, we want to talk to you about the church in China. And they go, and Sinicization. I said, oh yeah, well, I'll talk about, hymn writing. And they go, no. This is the policy of the government. Well, I haven't a clue. So I said, well, I don't know anything about that, but I think I'm going to go find out. So you have to distinguish between two terms, right? There's an original mission term that talked about the indigenization and the enculturation of the church. And that is very thorough and deep within China. I argue that the Chinese church is thoroughly Chinese, all right? Now, there are Western aspects like all churches everywhere and that kind of thing. But it is part of the DNA of China now. It deeply is. And affected. So the leading hymn writer in China is a Chinese woman who she's the Fanny Crosby of China. And that's what we sing on Sunday at OCGC. And there's this whole flowering. So that's one thing. But when you hear, one of the things very important for those who are observers, when you hear Sinicization on official things, it doesn't always mean the same thing. All right. And normally, in fact, some people are going away from the term Jidujiao Chongguohua because that's the official government term. And that's not an indigenization of faith. That is to conform the church to the state and to the ideology of the state. All right. And it's done by people who are Christians. All right, so I always find deeply humorous. They did this with Tibetan Buddhism. So you have two lamas. You have the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama. And the Panchen Lama is in Buddhism. The soul leaves the person who's dying, who is not, and then it goes from the dead person and floats over, and then it lands on some boy, all right, in China. And then all the monks have to come and discern whether that's the true Panchen Lama. But the government did not trust the Buddhists to do this. So they had a bunch of Communist Party officials who determined who the true Panchen Lama had landed on. Wow, that must have been quite a party. But so in the same way, that is not authentic Tibetan Buddhism. Again, but there, of course, there's another Panchen Lama who they say is the real one, but I think he was finally kidnapped by the government and sort of like the Lost Boys in the Tower of London during Richard III. Probably will never be heard from. Yeah, so that's what we mean by indigenous in both its varieties.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for your really interesting talk. I wanted to ask a question. I understand that there is a state accepted church, which people openly meet. I know that their preaching is recorded and monitored, and I'm asking, what are the sorts of flashpoints that are problematic for the Chinese government that would actually then push back and say, that's not okay, you can be a Christian in our society, but those things are not okay.
Okay, all right, what are the questions? So let's One of the things is it's more of a spectrum than an easy black and white. So just to give you an example of that, when I was teaching at TTC, a guy came to me who was being trained to be a scholar and teacher at the seminary in Nanjing, fully within the official government church. And his brother was a pastor of a large house church. And I said, well, how do you guys get together, families? He says, oh, it was fine. We work together. We made discipleship materials and it goes backwards. So it's not just black and white. So that's the first. Flashpoints. When you talk about anything to do with things that somehow touch on like eschatology, Jesus coming back, miracles, right? The lordship of Christ can get you in. Right? I mean, this has always got Christians. We're going all the way back to the Roman Empire. We said, you know, Caesar isn't Kurios, Jesus is. Okay, and so the government wants ultimate loyalty to be given to them, and Christians always, to a certain point, will defer. They'll go to that which is legitimate, but over you is another king. All right, and that's deep within the Christian and Jewish understandings of God and king. Pentecostalism is deeply opposed, especially signs and wonders. So anything to do, there's part of that is due to cults that are doing different things that will send the government off. Evangelism, okay, sets off. Teaching your children about the faith is always something. You're not to propagate the faith even within your own family. Nobody obeys that. You know, well, some may do, but any kind of propagation will do. So those kind of things. Also, if you're receiving things from the West and disseminating them, that's seen as subversive literature. Right? So everything just has to be government approved. But much of the way the church has grown and educated itself is by overseas Chinese writing up things, Chinese materials, getting it to the house churches that are then disseminated among the churches there. So again, the overseas church plays a really key role there. So again, anything that begins to question government control. Also, are you showing due deference in your worship service to the party and to be, you know, supporting the regime? There will need to be things that show you salute the government.
Any other questions? Yes.
So is the excellent, fascinating topic here. Is the Sinicization happening at the same levels in Hong Kong and Taiwan? Is it mainland?
And that's the interesting thing. All right. Yes, it's happening in Hong Kong fast. So it's on all schools now. You know, like on the day, they used to have a memorial to Tiananmen on 4 June. This year they closed the park, instead opened it up to a big Celebrate Beijing festival. But Sinicization is going full bore in. Now the interesting thing about can't go on in Taiwan, Taiwan's independent, but I watched that Zhongguohua term closely. So I was reading an article in the New York Times, and Chris Buckley, who's the China correspondent, he says that they're talking about Sinicization of Taiwan. I looked at that, and I just got dropped out of my chair. I said, last time I checked, I thought Taiwan was Chinese. All right. So I wrote to Buckley and I said, Chris, I said, can you get me, because it was, you know, he just used the English in quotes. So I said, can you get me the article? So he sent it to me, and I commented, and Taiwan, Zhongguohua wasn't there. So I wrote back, I said, Chris, it's not in here. I did a search, it's not in the document. He goes, oh, I sent you the abstract. I'll send you the full document. So sure, and I got it, and there it is. It's by a professor at Wuhan, and he refers to the need to Sinicize. That is interesting. All right. That's like saying I want to, you know, Anglify Northern Ireland. or, you know, just, yeah, I don't know. I want to make, you know, Americanize Kentucky. You know what that is, you know, what does that mean? But it really reveals what the true meaning of 中国化, and it's a term that's now getting utility in the Communist Party, in the official ideology, to get everyone to be Chinese by their definition, which would mean there's one China, all right, that the Chinese Communist Party is its leader, and that's not to be questioned, even if you're not in, and that would apply, interestingly enough, to Chinese citizens outside the country. So 中国化 has an impact on even Chinese, because if you're truly Chinese, you believe in this.
Is that
So-
what they?
So what are the percentages of Christians in, say, Hong Kong and Taiwan versus mainland?
Probably, I don't know, maybe more in Hong Kong. I don't know. I don't know my numbers that well in Taiwan. Taiwan tends to be more traditional Chinese. Church is relatively small. The church is growing much faster in mainland China. It's hard to get numbers, One time I wrote an article and they came in, they said, do you have any documentary evidence about what you're arguing? The last time I checked, the CCP Kuomintang wasn't doing minute notes for those meetings. I wanted to go home. John, were you gonna ask something?
I was just thinking about the activities of the so-called Chinese police stations in the UK.
Oh, that's really important. That's right. Gong'an is active. The public security is active in China, and they're monitoring Chinese here, and they are attending our churches. All right, but in fact, we've had a few that I'm pretty sure are checking us out at St. Andrews. But if you're smart, they're the easiest ones to lead to Jesus. I mean, I always look for them, and I've had a couple that have come to talk to me from time to time. Oh, someone really wants to meet you, and we'll go talk. And it doesn't take me too long to figure out that they're reporting back. But they're a great telephone, and not only that, they have to listen to all this stuff, and they get interested. It's amazing. But that is noted, and they're monitoring the Chinese as closely as they can. But again, it's counterintuitive. It works against what they want to achieve.
There is this question of what is sometimes called Dong's gamble, which was, in 78 to basically say, I'll give you a better washing machine every year if you make sure you never ever question the right of the Communist Party to rule China. And it's argued that that didn't work now, because actually in giving a more material level of prosperity, it has created the desire for the very thing they were trying to get, which is spiritual things.
Yeah.
Where do you factor this in all this? Because this is extremely internal, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
not to do with this external stuff that you're talking about. And how significant is it? Because I've heard that in some ways materialism has worked quite well as a way of tamping down the spiritual surge. It certainly worked in the West.
Or sometimes it's a beat to the president. I don't think they're necessarily antagonistic. There's something about the freedom of the soul that money allows. I remember there's a classic story that took place when we were down in Guangzhou of this farmer who was able to make money. And again, it was really but this farmer, they had a one-child policy. All right. And it was a huge fine. It was like 3 times an annual wage of a city worker. And this farmer gets 3 years, And so he comes with this sack with his money, and he comes and he dutifully pays the money to the official, and the officials pay. He says, wait, I've got more. He takes out more. This is for my next son. He just sent a message across the table and said, I'm in charge here. you aren't. All right. Let's be clear. Okay. material things do open up, but the other thing is part of the thing about a washing machine is it changes your thought and thinking and that kind of thing. Once you have the freedom of thought to a certain degree. Now, here's the question. Right? Can the system that C is putting together continue to build a strong, vibrant economy where all boats are rising? And that's going to be an interesting experiment because it offers, I think, a very powerful critique of the anarchy of the West. I mean, when I talk to Chinese and we have really think, oh yeah, Tom, you're right, and we want to have freedom of religion, we want to believe in that kind of thing. But we look at Los Angeles, San Francisco, London, elsewhere, and go, we don't want that. All right. Take, for instance, the pollution in Beijing. They've really severely cut that back by autocratic power. Right. That's an amazing thing. And if you're living in the middle of Mexico City and everything, or Delhi, and everything is just, they're breeding that stuff. There's some things to what Xi is doing in the Chinese Communist Party that has traction internationally. What will be interesting, I don't think it's a black and white thing, but there are aspects to Chinese governance and society that is finding some paths that maybe, all of us will sit back and go. But the test is, I mean, it used to be easy to throw rocks at the Soviet Union because they made everybody poor peasants, and it was terrible, and
Well, they became.
yeah, and they even have their own jokes. I mean, their own jokes about, the guy goes, he's paying for his car that he won't get in 7 years, and then he goes, the other guy goes, well, insurance, but I don't want to do for 7 years. And they say, well, why not? Because that's when the car will be built. So there's all kinds of crazy stuff like that. But that's not true in China. China engines are growing and that kind of thing. So just free will capitalism isn't necessarily, I think, God's way of governance or society as well. So how that all plays out. My own feeling is, I mean, within whatever society comes up in China, the Christian population will be ballast and be a blessing upon China anyway. And what I hope is that they will no longer see it as a threat, but as an ally. And I think that's what good Christians, like we see your society, can do.
Yeah, yes.
Thank you so much.
Last question.
It's all that we stop to think that we have to change our cars. But what intrigues me enormously is this whole issue of academic development with huge universities and doing so well over there. And yet no freedom to what extent is there academic development there? I mean, how do you develop academics secretly? Is it conversations, or how do you develop academically if there's no real thought freedom?
Well, there has been to a limit. So if you look at, it's not all, it hasn't been consistent all the way across the board.
Okay.
So if you go before C, there was all sorts of academic freedom flowing into China. When we had the China conference here in 2013, they were talking about all kinds of things that they can't talk about now. Okay. In fact, we're going to have a 2015 conference on universal values and Chinese distinctives, and all the scholars out of the leading university of China were coming to that. We had the creme de la creme. What we didn't know is that she had given a speech in late November, and I was already starting to book hotel or colleges for rooms in January. Said one of the 7 no talk abouts is universal values. Right? Husher, Jadger. All right. Okay. So that was one of the 7 no talk about. And then also I'm getting these letters from professors in Beijing, and I think we should cancel whatever. And we did, when luckily we didn't lose any money on it, because we would have been down tens of thousands of dollars if we booked in the rooms. But now, but there has been, and there continues those engines going. When she comes to power, he holds in 2015 this huge thing where he brings in all the leaders from the universities and they get a talking to. And the guy that they were talking to was, a guy who was rising, but he was a law professor himself who would always use foreign materials for his life. Everybody's kind of chuckling under their breath, but he said, no foreign sources are to be used in your teaching these courses. But there is latitude in certain subject areas. So, like, China wants to be the leader in terms of ultrasound use in surgery and that kind of thing, and I really let that go. But one of the things, if you know about international academics and how those work, we need each other. The firewalls you put up, right, to protect each other. I mean, I was part of the, I followed really closely this whole argument of whether the COVID started in the animal market or whether it started. I was still suspicious it started down the road at the thing, but part of that is you have to have firewalls in place because people going after money and after the rest will cut corners. So one of the things in Singapore, we had to go toe to toe with the Singapore government to say, look, you must build in academic groups that are reviewing anything that's going to go through. You have to have firewalls to protect workers. These are things you have to provide guarantees for Christian researchers that they can step down off of research if they feel it's unethical. And on your panels, they need to be made up of all kinds of people, not just the business and the scientists, but you need lay people there as well. And so we gave a white paper to the government, and we gave a small book for all the churches to talk about what the life sciences were, why they're so important, and how they'd affect them as citizens, so you can know these things that are going on that will impact you. But that was a really important exercise, and we had some really interesting back and forth with the government. But in the end, the government wisely took on some of the things that we brought on. We had some, it was really, it was one of the funnest things I ever did in my life, because our Singaporeans were some of the leading scholars in the world in their field. So we have Professor Cole, who was part of the genome project of mapping the genome. And she walks into a room, scientists just, she was with one group because she's a good Christian. That's
So David Lin, he wrote thesis about ethnic missionaries working outside China, and they were trained and commissioned by rural Chinese house churches. So they were facing a lot of troubles and problems because their missionary training was not good enough. And even their general kind of education level was very low. So it seems that it is very hard for the rural churches to produce their leaders, missionaries, and pastors. But as you say, there are many young, able, professional Christians living in the cities in China after returning to the other countries, getting PhD here and degrees. So there is a kind of imbalance in terms of Christian human resources between city churches and rural churches in China. Have you seen any case that these young professional Christians in cities coming to the rural area, getting involved in ministries? How do you think that they can sort out this human resource imbalance problem?
Well, it's a huge issue. I think probably David knows more than me about the possibilities, and I think David Rowe would be a good person to talk to as well. So I don't know. I don't know all that's going on there. Part of what's happened is the church in China during its real heyday was growing because of the Cultural Revolution. Everybody being thrown out to the countryside was in the countryside. It was among the common people, workers and that kind of thing, where the church really grew. It has now become much more of an urban and educated church. And that church is separated by class and culture from the more suburban thing. So one of the things you have to, and this is a problem even in churches around the world, Christianity will lift your boats, but once your boat gets so high, then you tend to look down upon those people who are not of your education level or whatever. We quickly become elites. But that's something that the church would preach against. That's why we have the walk in 2 passages from James. If you show deference to the rich and powerful, then you'll have no transgressors. And, but that's an ongoing problem. Yeah, I think the big issue now is even among those who are skilled and want to go overseas and do mission. When you're broken down into groups of just 6 people meeting for small house groups, then you cannot train mission. But I think the good news I heard from someone I know who knows is they said that's not quite how it is in the countryside. There's a lot more things going on in different parts, different things. So
Thank you so much for your presentation
Yeah.
today and your active interactions. Today.
oh, Israel. Fernando Bouillon says hello.
Sorry?
Fernando Bouillon